So thanks so much for the opportunity to be here again. My tack that I'm going to take is essentially the tack I think we need to take as we engage this secular, so-called secular society. And that is one of narrative or storytelling. Jesus does this well. 1/3 of all of the red letters in the New Testament are in parabolic form, and there's a reason for that. So storytelling is really critical as contrasted with propositional, data-driven dogmatics. Is storytelling or narrative or narratological theology. Also, our conversation, I'm hoping, will be dialogical, namely that we are always in dialogue with a trend, in dialogue with one another, in dialogue with truth. So where do we find ourselves today? So so we're on a road somewhere. We don't know always what kind of road we're on. Are we, as James Weldon Johnson says, facing the rising sun of our new day begun? Or are we living in the house of the rising sun? Which is not a good place to live, by the way. Is the sun setting on the road in which we find ourselves, or is the sun rising? It probably feels like a little bit of both. I mean, on the one hand, there are more Lutherans alive today than there have ever been in the history of the world. That's something to celebrate. More Lutherans alive right now than there have ever been in the history. On the other hand, the average Lutheran doesn't look like most people in this room, but looks like an East African, a Tanzanian, or an Ethiopian. Okay? On the one hand, things are looking good for Christianity globally. On the other hand, we find ourselves here in the West with some struggles and challenges of secularity. Which way is the sun going? What we do know is we're feeling under our feet. I feel the earth move under my feet, right? We got this tectonic shift. Thank you. You want to sing? You want to sing? Okay. We got these tectonic shifts that we feel under our feet. And I want to describe for us at least, and there are more, and you can add yours. I have 4 words that begin with the letter D that I'm going to describe just in a wide swath what these shifts are. First, we are experiencing significant shifts in terms of demographics. Demographics refers to what? People. Exactly. Demos, right? So people. And what? So, for example, the United States of America in 1960, the United States of America is 85% white. Okay, by 2060, the United States is 44% white. Is this a good or a bad thing for Christianity? It's a great thing for Christianity. Because immigrants and minorities, so I'm an immigrant. Thanks for letting me in. I was born in Montego Bay, Jamaica. Moved from there at 4 years old to Canada. Raised in Canada. I moved to the United States when I was 18 years old. Wasn't born in the Lutheran church either. My wife reminds me of that all the time. She said she let me in. But immigration is good for Christianity. The majority of immigrants, by the way, are Christians. You do know that. The majority of immigrants are not Muslims, okay? The majority of immigrants are Christians. And the majority of immigrants, when they decide to come to the United States, one of the things they think about is that they think they're moving to a country that is Christian. Okay? The majority of, the largest churches in the West, in terms of church attendance in the West, are minority churches. So I mean, just for common sense reasons, it behooves us to line up on the right side of these immigration questions. And not just do the knee-jerk thing because that's what our political party says. So welcome is a question that we need to think about when we think about demographics and where we are demographically. The year I was born, 1963, there was a Newsweek poll. I was born to an African Jamaican father and a Scottish Highlander see-through white mother, transparent. And in 1963, the year I was born, Newsweek did a poll of parents, white parents, and whether or not they would allow or permit their children to marry an African-American person, a black person. 95% said no. 1963. The day I was born, I wasn't born here, but the day I was born, January 14th, 1963, close to where you were living at the time, Brother Wiggins, there was a governor in the state of Alabama who stood on the steps of the Alabama State Capitol in Montgomery, January 14th, 1963, and said, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Okay? Before my 50th birthday, a president named Barack Hussein Obama is re-elected President of the United States of America. Now whatever you think of his politics, okay, that is an incredible demographic shift in this country. And I think it's because of that shift that we're seeing the kind of reaction right now in terms of white identity politics, or the identitarian movements. And I felt that viscerally during my time that I lived here in the US. I felt the earth move under my feet. I felt the shift and the change. And I felt the church, especially my own church, which I love, lining up on the wrong side of most of those questions. The next kind of trend in the culture is digitization. An incredible technological revolution with which Lutherans, by the way, again, should be very comfortable. I mean, it was this first revolution, which included the printing press and Gutenberg, that helped Luther and the Lutherans to win the Reformation, spread the Reformation. There have been more than one industrial revolution: mass production, assembly line, automation, computers, that's 1969, and then today where we find ourselves, where 2011 is actually the tipping point date. 2011 is the date where more than 50% of the US population carried in their pocket a computer. Okay, so that was the tipping point year in terms of the 50% of the population, which has just shifted everything. So is this good or bad? Well, this is both good and bad, of course, and it needs a whole lot of critique. And we need to be positioned well to critique it. If you visit an elementary school, ask the kindergarten teachers what are the #1 issues they see in their kindergarten children. And there you will see the devastating side of digitization, where you see attention spans and brains being entirely rewired. Okay, with its kind of all of this information, all of this data, and not very much room for interpretation of the data. The poet T.S. Eliot nails it when he says, so he dies in 1965, so it's incredible that he had this insight in the 30s when he wrote Courses of the Rock. And he says this, he poses 3 questions. Where is the life we've lost in living? Where is the wisdom we've lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we've lost in information? The need for critique and interpretation of information. And we ought to be in the middle of that mash, enmeshed in that mash. We ought to be in the midst of it, in the midst of that sort of engagement. And I know Lutheran Hour Ministries is really ramping up in some major ways, but we're still playing catch up. And Lutherans had typically been on the leading edge of technology, not on the backside of technology. Talking about, we don't use technology in my church. Do you have a hymn book? It's a technology. You got to be much more careful about it. It's what kinds of technology do we use? So, is technology a good thing or a bad thing? Yeah. I mean, it allows local farmers in West Africa, who I know, in places like Mali, to have access on a handheld computer to an app where they can learn what is the best time to plant crops, what's the best time to reap the crops, what's the best time, the optimal time to get the crop to market so they can make money and work their way out of poverty. It gives access to information, it democratizes information, so it's a mixed thing. But if we're not even in the game of interpretation, it shows why we're not engaged or engaging. Here's a statistic for you. I tell my students this all the time. By 2030, 12 years from now, when the majority of us in this room will be semi-retired, 12 years from now, 85% of the jobs that will be available do not now currently exist. Is that stunning to anybody, or just? Yes. Okay. Yeah, 85% of the jobs that will be available do not now currently exist. For our incoming 18 to 21-year-olds, which only compose, by the way, half of our students on our campus. The majority of, now over 50% of our students are no longer traditional undergraduates who live on campus. By the way, by God's grace, praise God, this year, record enrollment again at Concordia College of New York, 1,755 students. The vast majority don't live on campus. A third of them or less live on campus. Okay? And our traditional undergrads, 18 to 21-year-olds. So, but of the 18 to 21-year-olds who will graduate in 4 years, 50% of them will have jobs, 70% of them will have first jobs, 70% that have nothing to do with their diploma or degree. Okay. Because of this kind of rapid shift. So digitization. This is Senator Ben Sass. I don't know if you agree with his politics or not, but he's a man of great character, courage, and Christian faith. State of Nebraska. Had a chance to meet him a couple weeks ago. I've been tracking him and following him for quite a while. He wrote a book called The Vanishing American Adult that I commend to you. That book really looks at some of these trends and how digitization and all kinds of things are impacting young people. He's a former Lutheran college president, actually born in Missouri Synod. He, in that book, talks about the adultification of children. In other words, children are way overexposed to all sorts of technology, that they are now deprived of a life of enchantment. Enchantment, by the way, is one of the terms Charles Taylor talks a lot about. Deprived of a life where they can kind of fantasize and use their imagination in powerful ways. And deprived of that, they are adultified, overexposed too early, and then they grow up to be 40-year-old men, who are more interested in gaming and living in their parents' basements than they are. And so he talks about the infantilization of adults. So the adultification of children, which leads then to the infantilization of adults, because if you don't have a kind of normal way of, well, not normal, but because normal is a setting on a washing machine. If you don't have a healthy way of kind of developing your life and your mind and your imagination, and you're not going to grow up in a healthy way either. So The Vanishing American Adult. He's got another book coming out this year. I'm on back order for it. It's called Them, Why We Hate Each Other and How to Heal. That ought to be a book that our churches are preaching every Sunday. Why we hate each other and how we can heal. Ben Sass, I wanted to. So, digitization. The next kind of trend we see in the culture is this feeling of disconnectedness. So, we are more connected than ever, right? More connected than ever. Like hyper-connected. I mean, some of us are like having the mini kind of anxiety attacks right now because we're away from our device for 5 or 10 minutes, okay? So we're like more connected than ever, and yet we are more disconnected than ever. We're more so we see among young people, we're spending more money at Concordia College of New York in terms of our wellness center, because we are seeing more and more young people who are suffering from the kind of ravages of disconnection, suffering from alienation and depression, and the most hopeful period of their life when you're in college and the future's in front of you, and they are abysmally unhopeful. And this is a sign, in my mind, and Charles Taylor talks a lot about this as well, this is a sign that we are failing in secularity. The secular project, or the secular experiment, is essentially a failing experiment. I'm going to unpack more of that later, just get that thought. So disconnected, and then finally de-churching. So we see our churches graying, we see our churches thinning, we see our churches going out of business. So de-churching in the culture and in society. We see a different kind of spiritual connection between parents and their children. So my parents and I, the church thing was not something we negotiated ever. As I like to say, when I was a kid, we had a drug problem. Every time the church opened, we got drugged to church, okay? Okay, and it wasn't a conversation. It was an expectation. And we could not think or even consider thinking about life, relationships, or anything that mattered, apart from ascribing meaning and significance to that thing, bestowed or bequeathed or given to us by the divine. Everything that mattered in life had to do with something that had the divine design, the divine hand in it. And our children have the exact opposite. They cannot conceive of life in terms of the hand of the divine, in many cases, in many instances. I'm generalizing, of course, because you have to make a point. But cannot conceive. I have a pastor friend of mine, got on a flight, he had a collar on. He was in first class, and they offered him a drink. So he's like, WWJD, and what would Jesus drink? So he ordered, what did he order? Wine. A red wine, right? And the flight attendant was like, very good, just because you said so. He did so. Okay, so the flight attendant brings him a red wine, and, no, excuse me, she comes back to him, she says, she brings him a white wine, she says, sorry, sir, we're out of red wine, will this work? And he says, no, he says, that's not what I want. He says, you know what, just bring me water, I'll take care of the rest. And she says to him, what are you talking about? Okay, you can't presume the story, okay? We find where you can't even presume the Lord's Prayer. Whatever those were, who is art, and who is art, by the way. Yeah. There's definitely among some of our circles, as I mentioned, a decline of confidence. The capacity to maintain confidence in difficult circumstances is what morale is. And that kind of lack of confidence shows up in different ways. This loss of confidence. This lack of confidence shows up, or loss of confidence, when, you remember the days when we were on the front cover of Time magazine, 1959, and who was the guy's name? Marshall, the president of the LCA then. When Lutherans were like a force in the public space, remember when Ozzy Hoffman knew everybody, knew all the presidents, okay? So we've kind of lost that space, we've lost confidence. But that loss of confidence kind of shows up in different ways in different religious traditions. So have you ever heard where Tertullian said, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? Who's actually heard this, okay? And what is the answer that Tertullian intended or expected about what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? Yeah, that was the answer, exactly, nothing. And of course, when Luther came along, he kind of reoriented that question. He said everything. Luther said everything. That God's got two hands, right? And then, so the one hand is Athens, which is, so Athens there is serving as a trope or as a type for learning, for culture, for philosophy, for the academy, for, in our age, science, and everything we're talking. And then Jerusalem serves as a trope or a metaphor for religion, as a great religious city of three great religions, whatever, being headquartered there, or founded there, as it were. So Lutherans came along and said everything, because God has two hands. So it's God's hand that is at work in the secular culture, and it's God's working towards civic or civil righteousness, and it's God's hand that is at work in, just a little refresher on two kingdoms here, it is God's hand that is also at work in the church. Okay? And that the church is both saint and sinner, by the way. The church is both saint and sinner. Because it's composed of humans, like you and me, okay? But it's God also who is at work in the secular culture. And I think one of the things we try to do too frequently is it's like, so these two hands, they'll sometimes be in conflict, right? Those two hands will will often work together, okay? So it's a paradoxical relationship between the two. It's not an either-or binary relationship between the two, which is the way we've kind of set this. We've almost set this up like a kind of Manichaean distinction. Like you have the church and the gospel over on this side, which is holy and pure and without sin, okay? And then you got, the gospel's without sin, I get it, okay? But then you got on this side, the secular society, which is evil and of the devil and of the world. And that is not a Lutheran view. Okay? Yes, there is conflict at times between the secular society and the church, okay? But there's also complementarity and working together. And there's also applause that happens between the two. Those two work in conjunction, but God is the worker in both cases, on both sides. And both are fallen. We do not have a perfect church. We're not Roman Catholics. Okay? They both are fallen. The church militant, that is. So Athens and Jerusalem, what do they have to do with each other? Lutherans say everything to do with each other. That's why Lutherans have had great universities. That's what Mark Bierman was talking about. Why Johannes Kepler was able to challenge the received orthodoxy scientific. That's why Lutherans have worked hard for great architecture. That's why Jesus, when he describes the kingdom of heaven, says the kingdom of heaven is like, and what does he do? He picks up a seed, an ordinary, he picks up earthly, worldly things to describe what the kingdom of heaven is like in his parables. So here's what happens when Lutherans in the West, like us, have lost confidence. So what happens to progressive Lutherans is they end up jettisoning Jerusalem. They jettison Jerusalem. So references to Jesus or the things of God become less and less. They become often embarrassed by those references. They're just, so they end up jettisoning Jerusalem. But that, by the way, is not our problem in the Missouri Synod. Here's our problem. We end up, what sectarian Lutherans end up doing, is anathematizing Athens. Science, especially. The world, which is evil. And we're making a last stand bastion against the encroaching evil. Which is a shameful statement, an embarrassing statement for a society as privileged as ours to make, when there actually are Christians who are actually really suffering. See, when you suffer the loss of kind of tax status, that's not real suffering. Or loss of esteem in the culture, that's not suffering. That's not suffering for your faith. Okay, so we end up anathematizing prematurely Athens because we've lost confidence in the public square. And we retreat and resort to our tribal truths, which are particular, only local, and without any reference to data. That's what tribal truths are. So I'm going to talk more about transcendent truth. What I'm going to argue for is a confident cosmic Christology. A confident cosmic Christology. That in Christ all things hold together. That God so loved the entire cosmos. The creator of the cosmos loves the cosmos which the creator has created. And that Christ dies for the sins of the whole world. Not just for your sins, but for the sins of everyone, even people who are not like us. Christ dies for their sins as well. Just as a starting point, a confident cosmic Christology. I'm going to unpack more of that later. We're going to actually look at some Lutheran forebears who I believe propounded that when Lutheranism was a much more confident force. There's an essay we're going to look at by Arthur Carl Peakhorn called One Eucharist for One World. We're going to unpack that tomorrow. Okay, so here's where we find ourselves. And if you're a pessimist, my new favorite quote by John Maxwell, the pessimist complains about the wind, the optimist just expects it to change. Well, things are going to get better. And the leader adjusts the sails. So the point we're at is needing to adjust some of these sails. One of the things we've done at Concordia College is deepened our social mission, which is a focus on people, the way people actually are, the people who actually come to us. Not some kind of phenomenological people that we would like to see coming to us, but the people that God is actually sending to us, like the real human people that God is sending. I mean, you think about it, we have 38% of our students who have no religious identification. Isn't that an awesome opportunity? Are you kidding me? Check this deal out. They pay us to meet Jesus on our campus. Pastor Pelton, that's why you got so excited about coming to Concordia, New York. Yeah, because they pay us. So, and we provide a net revenue per student, it's called, okay? In order for us to do the mission work that we're called to do in that place. But they have to be the real people that God is actually sending to us. And to see those people for who they are. People made in the image and likeness of God. People who are more than meets the eye. Barry Hong is a 1967 graduate of Concordia College, New York. He received an Outstanding Alumni Award at our most recent commencement in May. And he describes Concordia College as the gateway institution to the American dream. Most of our students are first-generation students, are students who are Pell eligible, are students who are the first person in their family to get an education. Even the Orthodox Jews we work with in Brooklyn Park are women. And this particular brand of orthodoxy in Judaism did not allow women to get a college education. So we will have, we have 500 women by the end of the year in this program who are the first in their family to get an education. So it's a gateway institution to the American dream. Barry Hong is a psychiatrist. He went to seminary, but then when the Lutheran Wars happened, he lost his appetite in the 70s, and then just became a psychiatrist. Which is really interesting because, Charles Taylor also makes that point. Whereas people used to be under the authority of a priest in terms of their needs for wholeness and wellness, they're now under the authority of psychiatrists and their therapists for their needs for wholeness. So they just exchange. We're not doing well with secularity. They just kind of exchange one for another. That's the point Charles Taylor makes. So Hong works at Washington University. He's the chair of the psychiatry department at Washington University. And the psychiatry department at WashU in St. Louis is a part of the School of Medicine. The School of Medicine, if it were a standalone institution, would be in the top 50 in terms of research dollars in the United States of America. That's how large the School of Medicine is. His psychiatry department is larger in terms of staff and budget than Concordia College, New York. Okay, so that just gives you a sense of his proportion and a sense of his accomplishment. Here's what he says. He says, Concordia has something we don't have at WashU. And I say the same thing to you. You have something that a secular society does not have and needs. He says, what Concordia has, he says, is we've got the STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. We've got the STEM locked down. No one would argue about WashU's credentials in STEM studies. What we don't have are the roots that go with the STEM. I like the image. So the STEM needs roots. The STEM needs roots. And here's what Barry Hong hypothesizes. Hong hypothesizes that the roots at Concordia are faith, Jesus Christ. And he hypothesizes from his work in psychiatry that people are hungrier than ever for what the gospel of Jesus Christ has to offer, are pining more than ever. So if that's true, what Hong has observed in his years and years and years of psychiatric practice, what's up if that's true? Well, where is the disconnect? If people are pining and hungry and we are failing at secularity. And he goes on to say that you have something at Concordia besides faith. You've got the humanities. And the humanities, I say, are our human ties. The ties that tie us together. And what our students need more than ever if they want to be successful and effective in a economy where 85% of the jobs that are available do not now currently exist. They're going to have to learn the humanities. They're going to have to learn the great stories of Western civilization. They're going to have to learn how to communicate and how to use the English language in a way that makes logical sense. They're going to have to learn how to think logically. They're going to have to learn how to write clear sentences. This is what employers are looking for. They're going to have to learn how to deal with real humans with whom they have to look in the eye and get their eyes out of their laps and laptops and learn how to connect with other humans. And where else do people get a chance to do that? Except for in faith communities. That's what faith communities are forged for. To just spend time together with other human persons. So, Augustine was right. You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. So I want to just offer this as a sort of diagnosis of where we find ourselves in this so-called secular society and secular age. And I want to suggest that we not overreact. Okay, every era always thinks it's like the worst era that ever was invented. It's like since Plato has thought, the world's going to hell, these kids don't get it. Every era has thought that. Okay, so it's not like So don't over-ascribe to what the devil's doing in the world, and don't over-ascribe it. Some of it isn't like the devil in the world. Some of it is our own sinful flesh. Remember, that's the third source. Some of it's just us. Some of it's us. So don't, like, there's not that boogeyman out to get. Okay, Jesus Christ has already won the thing, okay? If the scripture has like a single message, it's 2 words, Jesus wins. Okay, that's essentially it, okay? At the end of the day, that's what happened. I don't think that love wins. I prefer Jesus. Jesus wins, okay? So we're meant for more. The society knows it's meant for more. I believe we have a phenomenal opportunity. Tomorrow we'll continue with what it means to be live in a world where we're meant for more and to be living signs, sacramental signs, living within, with, and under life. Thank you very much.
Does Dr. Nunes make anybody else's head kind of go? Yeah. and you need a minute to kind of unpack all of that and get at that, and yet there is already a question. Good.
Not a question, but a comment. You were talking about people being hungry. There's also an issue out there, all the anger that's going on. Mm-hmm. And the new term is angry.
Yeah.
And they apply that to people, with food issues. But I think it also, what you just said, applies to the emotional, spiritual side of it as well. People are angry because they're hungry and they're searching for the right answer to deal with all those issues. Just a comment.
Yeah, so Chris could say a whole lot more about that, but I will. What's his last name? Who did the devotion? Rick Armstrong. Yeah. Rick could say a whole lot more about that, but I'll say this, that we are living in the age of outrage. The age of, everyone, and so we've got this, on every side, we've got this, this kind of justifiable anger, whether it's in the pursuit of justice, or in the pursuit of righteousness, or in the pursuit of this kind of justifiable anger. It's interesting, a psychiatrist once said, interestingly, that anger is a secondary, not a primary emotion. So I don't know if that, is Rick still in the room? We need Dr. Armstrong, okay? But that anger is a secondary, not a primary. In other words, anger, so the primary emotion is, it's fear, or it's loss, or it's grief, or it's, pardon me? Fear, right? And the expression is it comes out as anger, so the anger is like the secondary emotion. But I think you're exactly right. And when you have kind of demographic shifts, the likes of which the world has never seen, no culture has ever had the kind of demographic shifting that we've attempted in the American experiment. In the greater New York area, 800 languages spoken in the greater New York City area. 800. There's no other megalopolis anything like, so megalopolis, 20 million people or more, anything even close to the levels of diversity that we are learning and rewiring our brains to learn. And because the instinct is not to be diverse, right? The instinct is to be angry, right, about these, and be threatened, and to be afraid. And that's why these pockets of anger are showing up everywhere, aren't they? So this is very, very good.
Now, can we tie that anger into the loss of courage?
Yeah.
Is that a possibility?
Loss of confidence.
Loss of confidence. Yeah. Well, loss of confidence and courage. You're talking about both.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think we can tie the anger into, when I knew where everything was kind of in the world, and I was in a kind of position of privilege in the world, so I'm talking about white anger now, because, whites are angrier than ever, especially white males. Wow! It's just stunning to me how angry white males are. And they're kind of, perceived sense of loss.
You look less than convinced. This is bad.
Well, I'm very serious. I got stories tomorrow about, angry white males, which is just stunning to me. Just stunning. And it's this perceived loss of power, perceived loss of confidence, perceived loss of positionality, perceived loss of privilege.
interested in how that whole two kingdom theology kind of begins to work itself together. And I don't think we think about that as much as we need to. So say a little more about how they complement one another, these two kingdoms of religion and of the secular.
So it's really interesting because the role and place of the Lutheran University is a place that has instinctively nurtured the so-called secular gifts. I don't like the term secular. I mean, gifts, and Christians who live out their vocation and calling in the world. Like Lutherans know this instinctively, innately know that one must not only be ordained or consecrated as a deaconess or as a teacher or ordained as a minister of word and sacrament in order to be in vocation. So that would be an obvious way, where you have the so-called secular vocations. So we have nurses that we graduate with. Our nursing program is in the top 5 in the state of New York. And our nurses understand that the men and women that they interact with in medical practices are more than mere mannequins and are more than meets the eye. See, so it's a different sort of anthropology, but they're still working as nurses. Our business graduates understand that it's not just about making money. It is about making money, but it's also around ethics, because we have an ethics-infused education. Our teacher ed graduates understand that even if you're teaching in a secular classroom, there is a dynamic between the student and the instructor that is a deeply spiritual sort of connection. So I see us, so Niebuhr would talk about, Lutheran understanding is that Christ and culture are in paradox, exactly. So they're in a kind of informed interaction. So tomorrow we're going to talk about prepositions in With and Under and watching prepositions. The prepositions are all about relationships. And it's not a Lutheran instinct to say that, this is the sacred society, this is the secular society. So we ought to be cultivating, architects to design magnificent structures to the glory of God. I mean, Bach, think about Bach. I mean, he didn't just write like church preludes. He wrote the Brandenburg Concerti, right? Which is secular music. But yeah, played in church all the time. This is really interesting. Your church is played, which is it's interesting, So the lines, Handel's water music, right, which is also played in church all the time, is a secular piece of music. It's not a spiritual, but it's fine because it's kind of all ours. It's all veined in us. It's all God's, kind of cosmic, confident, Christic perspective.
One might even say it's part of our humanity.
Yeah. Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, somebody brought up anger, road rage.
Yeah.
I had an example 4 years ago, though. I watched a man come out of his house with a bag of clothes under one arm, a crutch under another, and he was angry. And I said, what should I do? As I'm observing this from inside our house. And I told my wife, I said, I don't know, but you just keep an eye on what's going on. I'm going to go out there and see what I can do. The guy dropped his bag of clothes and he spilled out on the street. And I went out there and I helped him pick that bag of clothes up and put that bag under my arm and said, where are we going? And he was angry. He was cussing. And he was angry at the world and angry at what was going on in the house he just left. But by me stepping forward, face to face, eye to eye, 3 times I had to say, where are we going? Because he said...
Couldn't hear you. Yeah, he couldn't hear you.
No, he couldn't hear me.
Too angry to hear.
He said, I can handle this. I just want... 20 minutes later, we hugged each other.
So tomorrow I'm going to, in the morning, say more about us witnessing by our witness. So being with people, and that our witness is our witness. More so in this culture than our words are our witness. We'll get to words. You got to get to words. But you, brother, with that action, stood with him and walked with him and were beside him, and that's what mattered in that great illustration of the way you kind of engaged in his anger. Thank you.
And you also talked about narrative.
Yeah.
See, that's one of the that's an example of a narrative, and we've all got them. And so helping us identify those narratives and then being courageous enough to share those narratives as part of who we are and what we do. Why don't we go this way? You guys are thinking that, right? Cooking.
Hello. Am I on? There we go. Hi, babe. Maybe a comment or two you could give on the immigration issue. Several months ago at my Rotary meeting, we had the state's attorney from Palm Beach County was out speaking, and he's a Democrat. Okay? In Palm Beach County, that's what it is. In Martin County, where I am, the county north of that, we're primarily Republican. So you get those, but we're pretty much our group is much thinking broader than one way or the other.
The old-fashioned Republican.
So I asked the question, this was right when the whole immigration, the quote, people coming across the border and kids were ripped out of mother's arms and all this kind of stuff was going on. So I asked them, I said, what is exactly the truth going on? As state's attorney, what do you know as being the truth and what we're seeing on CNN or Fox News or whatever? And it was interesting, he really didn't answer me, but he said this, he said, this group this afternoon can come up with a reasonable immigration policy that all parties could agree to. But you see, that's not in the best interest of the parties. It's the parties on one hand is like, you're the most uncompassionate, hate-filled kind of party there is, you don't care about people and little mothers taking... And then on the other hand, it's like, you don't believe in the laws of the land and people are coming over here and murdering every child there is. And he said, they both use it to their advantage for their core group. And then you wonder why people are mad. Maybe the anger for me is not so much one way or the other. The anger is the politicians who don't make a resolution that's reasonable, compassionate, and loving, and lawful.
And that, brother, is why the church needs to speak up with its voice and not allow itself to get co-opted, as progressive Christians do, by the left wing of the Democratic Party, and allow itself to get co-opted as sectarian, arch-conservative Christians do by the right wing of the Republican Party, but to actually, which is what we've done on our side, to allow ourselves to get co-opted, but actually speak a word that speaks into that, and is a prophetic word. It's a prophetic word that cuts in multiple dimensions. So it's our voice that's missing in these kinds of conversations. But you're exactly right. I mean, they use, it's all a political game, and they use politics to stay in power. It's all about getting elected, getting dollars, getting reelected. I've got a friend who is a congressman, and I asked him, what's it really like? And he says, man, you have no idea. He says, I do 2 things. I raise money, and I run for office. That's all I do. I don't legislate, I don't govern, I don't lead, I raise money, and I run for office. And so, and one of the reasons I like Sass is I believe that I see something in him with his, he says this, he says, I'm one of the 5 members of Congress, of the Senate, of the US Senate, that this is my first term. And he says, and I feel like I'm a lesser person than I was because I'm a politician. He says, that's how, he says, that's what it's really like in Washington, D.C. So go ahead.
What can we do, as mainly most of us are parish pastors?
Around immigration. That's how your question started. Right? Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service is something you can do. LIRS.org. Okay.
Right. Well, I'm familiar with it.
Okay. So in other words, people gripe about the, do you know how hard it is for immigrants? Do you have any idea? You do? Okay.
We had some immigrants.
This is not a joyride being an immigrant, okay? So I came over as an English-speaking, relatively educated immigrant, and it's hard. It's very, very hard, you know, to assimilate into this country. So advocacy is something we can do. Standing with people is something we can do. You know, and not falling, as you said very well, brother, for these kind of stereotyped responses. My grandparents, when they got to Ellis Island, they came here legally. You know what they did? They showed up and didn't have syphilis.
Right.
That's essentially what they did, okay? That's basically all you had to basically do, okay? And then you got a new name, and you know, and then now you're an American, okay? So I mean, we need to be moderating voices in all of the kind of political diatribes that are not about the issues. I agree. They're primarily about politics and power.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We got 3.5 minutes. Pastor used the word prophetic, and get your brain around that, because you're going to have to get used to being prophetic if you're going to speak into this generation. Please.
I don't mean to make you go over old ground, but I was wondering if you could reflect a little more on how we are failing at secularity. Because I'd love to go back and tell my congregation, that's right, they're failures. I'd like a little more insight before I shoot that off in a stupid way.
Well, I think you mean tell them that they're failures. You mean your congregational members who are as secular as the people outside of the church? They are. I mean, they are. Let's be honest. I mean, they are. So, except they have the promises. They have the promises, they know the promises, and they rejoice in the promises. You know, I was thinking, Pastor Dr. Gregory Walton, I was thinking as you were speaking about, you know, the two pastors, and how's this go? Okay, here it is. So, church gets a new pastor. Old guy kind of walking out of church and says, Pastor, I tell you, I really love this, the way you preach. Listen to you 3 weeks now. It's amazing. You're much better than our old pastor. The guy says, the pastor says, well, you know, I'm not really trying to be better than him. I mean, what kind of things did he preach? Well, he says, you know, the old pastor, he preached that we're going to hell. And the new pastor said, well, you know, sometimes I preach you're going to hell too. Haven't you heard that in the last 3 years? He said, yeah, you do. But you know, when our old pastor preached it, when you preach it, you know, it sounds like it's breaking your heart. When he preached it, he sounded like he really enjoyed the fact that So, be careful what you say to, you know, about them, or where, you know, who's heading to hell. What I'm trying to say about that is the kind of Augustinian, this is what none of this stuff is new. The Augustinian gaping void that our souls are restless until they rest in you is nothing new, okay? And it's because of how God created us as God's own beings that we have this kind of core notion that we're meant for more. There's got to be more to life. That's why people kill themselves. That's one of the reasons. Because there's got to be more than this. There's got to be better. There's got to be something better than this. In some cases, right? So we're essentially failing at secularity, is what I'm saying. The attempts at secularity are essentially failing.
I have a little bit of a story to tell. This is not a commercial for the LCMS Youth Gathering next summer in Minneapolis. But as we start our process in selecting program and theme for the gathering, we bring together a bunch of people who work with young people, some planners for our event, as well as some young people, to have conversations about faith, about life, about God's Word, about their interaction with the church, what they would like to see from an event like the gathering. And in this case, since we were in Minneapolis, we had students from Concordia St. Paul come and join us in the conversation. In that conversation, we heard a lot of these things that you read about in Taylor's books, or that President Nunes talked about the secular age and their wrestling with living as Lutheran Christians in that world. The beauty of it, the struggle of it, They're desiring to share their faith in Jesus Christ with their friends and with sometimes their family and with the world. To be able to bring truth into sometimes difficult situations, sometimes uncertain situations, and be able to point people back to Jesus. And as we had about a day and a half of time in God's Word and prayer and conversation, we kept coming around these words. And it really, in some way, doesn't make a lot of necessarily sense in terms of the theme. It's not a huge, complete sentence, a whole thing that maybe fits together. We've had people, especially outside the LCMS, not kind of quite get it. Like, what's real present cod? Is this some sort of fish convention that's going on in Minneapolis, something like that? No. We have to try to explain what this is. But these were the words that kept coming up. And brought us to Psalm 46. So glad that Pastor Armstrong started us in the Psalms devotional time. It brought us back to that word and that word of comfort that we have from God about when the seas are roaring, when the waters raging, when the ground around us is collapsing. God is our refuge and strength. That firm foundation, that mighty fortress that we know, as Luther so well reminds us, the mighty fortress is our God. We had young people talk about, I want to know about God, that God is real, and how do I help my friends understand that? And maybe they haven't had the upbringing that I have had. How do I speak into those times? How do I be present for my friend when, again, this thing distracts me all the time? I had one young lady talk about that I came to college, I thought I was going to get away from all that drama back home. She came from a small town, so I thought I was getting out of that. And I can't step away from it because they found me on my social media. I'm getting brought back to these things that I was trying to get away from and to try to have a different relationship with people. And then also, of course, too, their love of God and the knowledge of the love that God has for them in Christ Jesus, too. And how we stand in that in the faith given to us in our baptism. And so that was the thing that we came up with as we go towards next summer. And again, many of these things as they wrestled with the secularization of our culture, of their schools, of their lives, and how do we bring truth into that. That was, of course, too, that was January of 2017, right after the election in 2016, when news of talk of fake news, and all these things that were taking on in our culture. And where do we also find truth? There are a number of reasons why we did a really comprehensive study as best we could within the LCMS of studying of millennials. I'll get a little bit more into who those millennials are. But this was an opportunity for us to really, as we've been talking about here, to listen. To listen to young people who had grown up in the church, to some who had left the church, to some who were very much still connected, and to some who had fallen away, but yet still called themselves LCMS Lutherans. And in my workshop, I'll get into more of the details of the statistics. We're not going to talk about a lot of that, except for a few things to talk about, a little bit of the narrative, maybe, of how we got to where we are. Now, I too believe it's a great time to be in the church, and to be working with young people, and to be working with pastors and lay people, and DCPs and teachers who work with young people. But I am going to talk about probably some sobering statistics, is the reality, as we start at least this time. But many of you know them, and you know them well. It'll be a chance for us to kind of start that dialogue a little bit in terms of where we are and maybe what we see in the output of some of the secularization. As we dug deep into our research, this was one image that kept coming back to me. Anyone recognize this? Yeah, well known from CPH, right? One of Richard Hook's The Good Shepherd. This is one that I remember well from my childhood. The image of Jesus with that lone sheep on his shoulders. As a kid, I would imagine me being that sheep, that one that Jesus loved that much. And I grew up in Montana, so those mountains look familiar to me in the background. I knew trails that went into those mountains. I knew what was back in those mountains. Bears, wolves, places to fall off, and yet I knew I had a Jesus who would search me out and find me before I go into those places. This was an image that kept coming to me thinking about pastors and our churches as we think about young people in our congregations. is that they already, even in the church, know how the secular age bumps up against them, how often they have to face it, whether it's, again, on technology, whether it's in their schools, whether it's in their communities. And they're asking for those questions to be equipped. And how do I combat it at times, maybe? But then also, too, how do I appreciate it, right? How do I appreciate this world in which God has placed me and in my vocation serve? And to hear their heart for their love for people, their friends that they are out sporting events with, in classes with, and again, they are not the enemy. They are people who God loves as well, just as they are deeply loved, and want to be equipped in their vocations to be able to share the good news of Jesus Christ. Particularly look at the quote from Matthew 18 as we think about our young people. This is in the context of Matthew 18, verse 1, where the disciples asked Jesus, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And Jesus' word, as he teaches, as he tells this narrative, says, "See that you do not despise one of these little ones. For I tell you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven." What do you think? If a man has 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go in search of the one that went astray? And if he truly finds it, truly I say to you, he rejoices over it more than the 99 that never went astray. So it is not the will of my Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. What a love that we know of our Heavenly Father and the opportunity that we have to chase after those sheep that have come into the waters of baptism, to keep them connected to the church and in the love of God and Jesus Christ, and be able to form relationships with them. A little bit about some larger statistics. I'll talk about more of these in my workshops, but just to give a snapshot and to tell a little bit of the narrative, maybe where we're at. Years ago, Terry Dimmer, my predecessor, just started looking at aggregate numbers of baptisms and junior confirmations, and could see certainly the decline of what was happening across our church body. We did some just research with the statistics itself and heard from many pastors and others who said, yeah, that's what I see in my church. We haven't had the same numbers of kids since the plant closed. We haven't seen the same number of kids in our church since farms started to consolidate. We didn't need large families to work the farm. We haven't seen the same number of kids in our church since maybe the urban demographics changed. Things have never really been the same. This is a little bit, hopefully you can see it okay. It takes two key numbers in our, one for the LCMS and one for the United States. And the line up top, the blue line, which fits with the scale on the right, is the number of annual births in the United States. So you can see the baby boom, real high numbers, but as you can see too, really our annual births are back to the same rates as they were in the baby boom era. Some of that, immigration. Some of that is women having children later in life. To where there was, again, more total children being born, or as many people, young children being born in the United States as back in the baby boom era. So you see dips, the Gen X at the time, some of that's the economy, and some of that is other things that are again taking place demographically as well as socially. The other number, the green number, the one that continually slides down, is the number of baptisms within the LCMS. With the scale of the number on the left. We peaked in 1959. The number of baptisms in LCMS congregations. So that gives you, again, a little bit of an idea that essentially our baptismal numbers are about a quarter of where they were in the baby boom era post-World War II. So indeed, fewer children, just to start with, coming into the waters of baptism in our congregations. Excuse me. Another thing, too, that I'll talk about here in a minute is about retention. And an interesting thing that we saw, as is seen in other data, is that we're probably at about 50% retention from baptism to confirmation within our LCMS congregations. So 1 in every 2 of your baptisms across the LCMS do not make it through confirmation. However, those numbers already started to slide in the baby boom era. It's not like the millennials have just dropped off all of a sudden. It's already started the baby boom. I'm a Gen Xer. Even got worse in the Gen X era. To where, again, what we saw is that millennials were not in the church to begin with, as we see with these baptismal numbers. It's not as though they walked away from the church. They weren't there to start. A little bit about the millennials themselves. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because this gives us an avenue to talk about ministry with young people. We learn things from millennials that are going to be applicable to baby boomers, that are going to be applicable to Gen X, that are going to be applicable to the next generation, Gen Z as well. Couple things that we use the Pew number now that they said they have set it in stone. The millennials are those who are today are aged 22 to 37, born 81 to 96. Primarily children of the baby boom generation, but they now also outnumber that generation. As we've been talking about, the most diverse generation of adults in terms of race and ethnicity, and certainly one of the most educated too, you can argue in many ways. And they're changing everything from corporate cultures to traditional business practices and to the way we communicate. So how many millennials do we have here? Awesome. Thank God for you. Awesome. Awesome. Now, how do you love being the most talked about generation, right? Are you tired of it yet? Like, oh, great. Another presentation on millennials. Another thing that we can hear that we ruined, according to Facebook, the wine industry. Of someone as a joke sent me an article that now hotels, I didn't really check it out here to help yet. At hotels, they're no longer using the top sheet because millennials, for some reason, don't like it. I don't know. But anyway, there's all these things that you can find out that millennials are doing and changing things. But you know, too, how that's changed corporate cultures and it's changed the church as well in terms of what we see. There's a little bit of research. This actually isn't ours. This is from Communities Today. They do major sampling, kind of in between each major census to look at religious communities. So interestingly, this is one again that talks about, on the far left is the US population, which shows millennials are 24%, so about a quarter. So again, large generation, more than baby boomers in the United States population. In the middle is US Protestant churches. And you can definitely see writing outside the LCMS talking about where the millennials. 12% is the estimate for US Protestant churches, which would be non-denoms, others that are part of that group. 12% are that millennial age. But interesting, in the LCMS in that same study, we were at 15%. So actually higher than the average US Protestant number. Still significantly less than the US population, but yet nonetheless that the LCMS had done pretty well in retaining millennials. The other thing too that I want to bring out, something for much joy, is look at that lower number. 24% of the LCMS are young people, aged 18 and younger. So as our demographers and sociologists talk about, there's a replacement age, if you will, of these young people that if we can keep them connected to the church, we bring them into areas of leadership, we show them that there's a place in our congregations and in our church body, what a great opportunity that we have to connect with them. So in that, again, part of that retention piece is that we really started asking, well, how can we help congregations wrestle with this a little bit? What can we learn from millennials in this retention struggle that we're having? And even learn from previous generations that, again, those numbers were starting to slide. As I said before, just from a strict statistical standpoint, our retention rate from baptism to confirmation is about 50%. So again, that's basically, we kind of created an echo and looked at it from a number of different years. Let's say if you were born in 1960, we would look at the confirmation rates in 1973 to kind of give you a rough average there, but the statisticians use a lot of different things to kind of grade that a little bit more, so because you never know that they're necessarily 13 years of age. But again, that we saw, as we use that kind of 13-year echo, that if you look at baptism numbers and say 1 year and add 13 years onto it, when again it would be about the age of confirmation, that's about what our retention is, about 50%. In the same way that our research that we just did, that again I'll go into just a little bit here, is that we saw though that from confirmation to young adulthood, that we only retain about 31%. So 1/3 is what we saw in our research. Again, LCMS confirmed members from when they leave confirmation to whether they reconnect with the church after, say, college, military service, starting their career after high school, only 31%. And along with that, another 30%, we had churches respond to us that we just don't know where they are. I can't speak to whether they're in an LCMS church or not. And this was basically, we were just asking them to go back 10 years in their confirmation records. And already that relationship had been lost with that young person in 10 years. Pew Research piece saw for LCMS statistics that we retain about 37%, but interestingly, that their researchers show for all generations were only about 33% anyway. So actually, we retain millennials better than we did across the generations, is what the Pew Research saw. And then of course, that's the study that Pew did where if you maybe heard the rise of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, in terms of those who had no religious affiliation. President Nunez showed it in his statistics from Concordia Bronxville, that again, we see that increasingly happen in our society. So 35% again show no affiliation. And going back to the previous slide, is that, again, there's major drops within the U.S., general U.S. Protestant groups. So again, some things that are very good. But what this got me thinking is that when I think of the parable of the Good Shepherd, Jesus isn't running after, if you will, if you think about our LCMS congregations, one sheep, but a third was gone, or more, and bringing those who are lost, who have left the church potentially, back into the fold. And how do we engage ourselves in leadership, servant leadership? How do we engage our congregations in being that church that connects with our sheep, loves them, connects them in the fold so that they know and are encouraged in their life in Christ? A couple of things that we could talk a lot about this. Certainly Taylor's book goes into this, and we'll be talking a lot about this over the next couple of days. From what we heard from Millennials, this again was a great exercise in listening. And there's a lot of data that I can throw up, and I'll again do that in the workshop tomorrow. But really, to not forget that there are people behind that data. These are our own children. These are our nieces and nephews. These are our friends whom we love, that many, again, have maybe left the church. I mean, church weeks. Some maybe have just left the LCMS and they found a home in another church body. And there's many stories behind why that happens. Maybe got connected during college, maybe married someone from another denomination, whatever it might be, many stories where that takes place. And yet we still have that yearning too, to have them maybe back in a Lutheran context, to have those leaders that maybe have left to be going to our seminaries and going to our Concordia universities, becoming church workers, so that other people may know the good news of Jesus as well. And so there's a lot of different ways, again, that we can parse that data. But to not lose the fact that as we think about that opportunity to study, there really was an opportunity to listen and to hear and to walk along with them many times. Things that we heard was certainly the rampant individualization or the subjectivity of our culture. So if you're familiar with moral therapeutic deism, this was something that was coined by Christian Smith, National Study of Youth and Religion, about a decade ago, as they they're amazed to hear kind of at how their adherence of young people were the religious groups. But then when they started to really get into the conversation about God, about their faith, and this was across the whole, this was not just Christians, this was kind of all religions, is that basically this piece that he coined was their understanding of religious faith was moral, that it's a place where I learn maybe what to do right, or at least wrestle with that. That it's therapeutic, so in other words, religion is there to make me feel good about myself, not to forgive my sins as we would look at it, or to know grace, but it's to feel good about those things. So when that's not happening, what does that mean about my religion if I don't feel good? So you ask those questions. And then, yeah, I get it, there's a bigger thing going on. There's a God, there's something beyond me, I can see that, and that I don't really have faith in Him, or I don't see this as saving faith, but yeah, I can believe that. And so kind of Christian Smith's point was to the church was, man, we got to pick up our teaching. We got to pick up our connection. You know, Christians are going to say that's not a saving faith. Christians are going to say we believe in Jesus as our Lord and Savior, who died on the cross of Calvary for us for the forgiveness of our sins, who died and then rose so that we would have eternal life and have life to its abundance now. And so really it was a wake-up call for many people to check our teaching and really have good conversations around that. Another thing too is that search for truth. With the amount of data, information that are at the hands of our own hands, our young people, I think of my wife teaches preschool, and she's amazed that when she'll try to have a conversation with a young person and she doesn't know the answer, she'll try to be talking about, make them be inquisitive young people. Like, yeah, I wonder. She can't believe how many times she hears, yeah, I wonder too. Well, Google it, Mrs. Kiesling. You don't need to wonder. Why are you wondering about it? Look it up. There's no need to wonder. And yet you know too the answers you can get from Google. If young people are asking spiritual questions about their identity, and you just go Google that, you know the kind of answers they're going to get. How are we helping them have those filters of truth that we know in God's Word? And I know Taylor talking on this too, we could talk a lot about this again, that change in sexual ethics. That's still a huge issue for millennials and for Gen Z too. About that question, whether it's gender identity, whether it's sexual attraction, whether it's just that role of man and woman in society. Great places again to be connecting with young people and to be getting them into the Word of God. One, this might talk about this in different contexts. President Walton mentioned this as well as a replacement of church and also other institutions as the center in public life. So yes, they are hungry for relationships. They're hungry for that. They're not going to show up at an institution, or actually a location, just to go make relationships. They're going to make relationships where they're at in their locations. So I was talking to someone recently about really struggling with, he doesn't see millennials in church on Sunday. And yet he can go to the soccer game on Saturday morning, and all these people he knows that or he thinks should be at church are everywhere. He says, I don't get it. Why are they there and not in church on Sunday? And on one way, let's celebrate that they're caring for their kids. They're involved in their kids' lives. They're there. They're getting into soccer. They're building that community that's there. They want those relationships. And he's seeing the relationships that are happening amongst the parents that are there. Then how do we capitalize that then on the church to have that community take place within congregation? So we heard really strong things from those who remained LCMS and active LCMS. They would say that they're there because I love the community. Because I know somebody. They know me by name. And that I cherish that and I love that. And so that importance of finding those, how do we form that? Especially when we do maybe think of those people outside of the church who were not raised in the church. If we're going to believe that the millennials were not in church in the first place, they don't know that the church is the place to go form relationships. They're forming them someplace else. So then how does the church form those relationships with those outside the walls of the congregation and find creative ways to do that? How are we encouraging our millennials who are in the church and their locations to reach out and form relationships with those who do not know Jesus, that they may know? Internal strife in the church. Look at this on two ways. One is that there is still probably some conversations that we could have about what has happened within the LCMS broadly. Maybe this isn't such probably a big topic, maybe in the Florida, Georgia area, but if you attended the seminary in St. Louis, you know that you could go church to church and talk about what happened in the early 70s in your church. What happened to your leadership? We had churches who left the Senate over that, Seminex and other things that took place. And there's still some ideas where we still haven't necessarily dealt with and talked about that conflict and just conflict in general in the church realm. And how can we talk about that and seek forgiveness when it's necessary? At the same time, too, internal conflict in the church on a regular basis at our local congregations. Young people watch. They know when the church is in conflict. They know when there's a big voters meeting coming up. They know what mom and dad are saying about pastor or whoever it may be after church. They know those things happen. And one thing we heard loud and clear from LCMS active millennials was that I went to a church that handled conflict well, and it was really a beautiful thing. We talked about it. We sought forgiveness. We reconciled. And how so many that left said, I don't need any, I got enough conflict in my life, I don't need it at church. And left. And so how do we handle that internal strife? And I think again, that knee-jerk reaction, when there are people who disagree with us, how do we have that conversation? How do we welcome maybe those who ask questions? The other big piece then that we saw too in the secularization was we do another major study at the youth gathering. And that's where we actually have high school students themselves answer a wide range of questions. It's not scientific in the sense that it's not random. You kind of have to show up to this area, you take this poll, we get the data. Now it's a lot, we get a good percentage of the participants that take it, but yet it's not necessarily a random survey. And we're starting to see a number of hot topics, if you will, in our society, starting to take a dip when we ask, well, what's your opinion, what's your thought, what's your belief about this piece? They're starting to take an area that was going definitely down the lines of what we see with secularization, especially around some of the sexual ethic pieces. To the point to where this last gathering, less than 50% of the participants said that, yeah, I can call out and say that sex before marriage is wrong. Now, their practice would be more in line maybe with what the church teaches. I'm not sexually active, but again, I'm not going to have that confidence to talk to my friend about their sexuality, because they can kind of do whatever they want to do. I'm good with me, but I'm not going to talk about it with someone else. I'm not really sure. Can I say that for them? I don't know. And having that confidence. And so we saw things too within that data to where, again, less than 50% were on some of these hot button issues were in line with what the church teaches. So at the same time, this last time, we for the first time polled our young adult volunteers. These are amazing young adults who come and serve at the youth gathering. Any alumni here? I don't know, we might have a few. Served? Okay, so they come, hundreds of young adults, 19 to 25, come and serve at the gathering. These are exceptional young adults. They pay to come work really hard for 7 days. A lot of them are on our Concordia campuses, maybe even travel with their groups that are coming to the youth gathering. One thing that blew us away, we did a very similar survey for the first time with them in 2016. And we asked them many similar questions. And their answers were very much in line with what the church teaches. And it blew us away. Like, how did we get from, again, seeing these things changing with our high school age to where our college age students were back more in line with what the church teaches? And we thought, do they get on a Concordia campus and is that changing? They get more teaching, they get the word, they get around more Christian friends? Or our other concern is, or is it those that are maybe starting to see, again, different ideas? Are they stepping out of the church? So that was another reason why we got into doing this other additional research, really getting into the depths of asking millennials about their life in the church. A couple of things I take away about thoughts on connecting with millennials and Gen Z. One is to ask and answer the why question. Why we do these things in the church. Explain well our practices. Why we interact the way that we do, what is special about what we do, and also, maybe also take a little bit of evaluation. Is it important that we do? Are there sacred cows in your church that maybe need to be discussed and understood? Certainly the importance of listening, to be people-focused, to hear their stories, to walk along with them through difficult times and also times of joy. To remember the currency of relationships, to value relationships over program. Another way to put it in the church speak, relationships over membership. That more and more we see millennials who will gladly come and join and be a part of your congregation, but they really don't care about whether they actually officially join your church. That's not the way they talk. That's not the way they think. As well as to get past the false narratives. Do you want to guess, out of 2,000 millennials who gave us feedback, how many said that, you know what, I'll find a church when I get married and settle down and have kids? 1 out of 2,000. 1. If that's what you're betting on to get millennials back in the church, it's a false narrative. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but that's not the mindset. So let's not take it for granted that that's going to happen. 1 out of 2,000. Again, parents, still the most influential people in their faith life, encourage them. Encourage the family of God to be those people, again, who seek out those young people and show them love and Christ's love. Another key piece, too, to hand off well during major transitions. As you would guess, high school graduation is this major time that we lose young people from our churches. Again, that's just not LCMS churches, but the American Christian Church. How are we preparing them? And give thanks to God for this district and how important you make campus ministry, that you have voted in as part of your convention. Thank you. And please continue to lift that up as a district and in your congregation. How are you preparing young people as they make that transition, and also others? How can the church love on them, connect with them, and really make that an emphasis as a time when the Christian body is there for them, the people of God? Be honest and authentic, take on arguments, repent when you need to, and teach well. Be honest about things that are going on in the church. Sins aren't just happening in the Catholic Church, they're not just happening in this church and that church. Be honest about what that means. Be honest about how Satan can work in those times. Have those conversations with young people. Also lift up, be aware of the idol, in some cases, of post-World War II America in our congregations, because that is maybe one that's more in the Midwest. I'm going to stop there with just a couple of thoughts on connecting with millennials and Gen Z, again, primarily from the research that we did. And if you want to hear more about the actual specifics of the research, I'll be doing my workshop tomorrow.
For a few more years, more of my Sundays will have been spent in the church pew than out of it. I was raised in the church and blessed with a stable family. I was part of a weekly church service and given leadership and growth opportunities while I was there. I had a healthy relationship with my pastor, who guided me from baptism through confirmation. I was, in more ways than not, the statistic that should have made it to being an active adult member in one of your churches. But I'm not. My home church, the church I was baptized and confirmed in, is Woodlands Lutheran Church in Central Florida. Growing up, when I would look from the pew towards the cross, I could see through a simple glass window outside. There was an expansive wood-lined glass wall. Behind the cross, behind that glass, is a patch of sprawling live oak, saw palmetto, and Spanish moss. Every Sunday I would look out at that during service, seeing the sunlight shift on the bark of the oaks as the sermon progressed, watching the moss move gently one day, then like a gray flickering fire the next. Seeing that just behind the cross was creation in all its glory and covenant. Beside the church was Woodlands Lutheran Campground, and I did spend weekends, afternoons, and summers there on its nearly 200 acres. Fishing, walking aimlessly, camping, working. By my teens, I felt comfortable outdoors in the woods alone. It was out there, really, that I first felt the depth of God. Now, I experienced yearning in church. I would feel moved by God when reflecting the scripture. I would often hear God in the sermon, and I loved spotting God in the eyes of people sitting in the pews. But it was in the patterns on the tiny scales of fence lizards that I really met God. It was in the pine, when the wind would move through the trees, that's where our relationship developed. In nature, I discovered meaning and significance. To me, the natural world is God. The integrity of creation is all there on display to dissect and to explore, to prod and to poke, to get to know and to love, to come to caretake. I won't deny that it wasn't very long before I felt restless in the pew, but it didn't come from a loss of meaning or a loss of transcendent meaning either, or a loss of belief. I wanted to feel God, and for that I looked past the cross in the church and past the glass wall and towards the live oaks and the resurrection fern and the palm. I grew angry at times at the glass, wanting instead to be out in the wind and the warmth of the sun. The wooden pews, they were just a crude scribble next to the artistic elegance of a southern red maple. To hear God in the pileated woodpeckers and the shuffling of armadillos, that is the sermon that I was longing for. My childhood was light on pain and trauma. I did not feel wretched or unworthy. I was the firstborn son in a first world republic. It's not that surprising then for me to connect my faith and enjoyment of creation as a child. I did not have to face God and belief from the position of physical need or suffering. In many different ways, I grew up with privileges that focused my expectations of belief and my needs from God. I was loved deeply and encouraged to succeed. I squirmed and rebelled where I could, as most kids do. But life never felt impossible and goals never felt unattainable. That is a piece of the secular framework we have here in the developed modern world, a framework that makes just as much room for entitlement as it does for equality. But part of maturing, part of growing up is coming to see that pain and suffering in the world. No matter your social positioning, your faith, your race, your economic status, we all come to see the shadow and darkness of sorrow. Youth uncover meaning here through the cultural and religious framework that is handed down to them, through the examples they see in their community, their books and movies, and in their churches. In the Western world, where biological needs have been mostly met in spades, we tend to throw ourselves into the workings of culture and law, to approach and address the subtler shades of pain, to focus on, for instance, the trauma that's occurred between the civilized and the natural. You see, where I saw the effects of suburban sprawl, the fragmentation of wild places, the rapid-fire home construction, and the rampant expression of capitalism, I saw it through the lens of my expectations of belief. I came to see society more and more as an agitator to God, not as a place of its people. I saw idolaters of capital and consumption. I saw a decay of meaningful living. I saw a watering down of any expression of grace. I saw development as an affront to God, as a desecration against the glory of creation, as a deliberate rebuttal to the preservation of life. The more I began to learn of the world as a youth, the less I saw people moved by the Spirit of Christ and more moved by the weight and power of earthly judgment or the promise of profit. Is that perspective right? Certainly not completely. But out of that understanding, I felt moved to act. I felt moved to defend the sanctity of creation. I felt called to speak up for the voiceless, to study and protect not just the wild spaces, but the idea of wilderness itself. Others may be drawn to championing the worker, the family, the woman, the marginalized, the unfed, or the sick, but my posturing towards the pain and suffering of the world that I saw pointed towards the natural world and our role in it. My passions may not stir your hearts, and that's okay. I will continue to advocate for wild spaces as a powerful place where meaning outside oneself can be found, where the sensation of the not-self can be breathed in. But others will find that belief elsewhere. We all have a personal relationship with God, and with that, we each have individual callings that motivate us through our lives. As pastors, you see those callings in your congregants, and you stir that belief into action and understanding. It is not an easy job. How we navigate those callings, how we negotiate the areas where our paths cross or seem to rub against each other, that is something that Adam, even in his righteousness, could not figure out. It's tough. It's the world of creation, the world of culture and rules, the world of sin. It's the world where we all interact, and where it seems we mostly wallow around in misunderstanding. And we know it is sort of possible to suspend here, to engage in a vocation of human and earthly improvement, even while motivated from a belief in God, to argue for judgment, to demand virtue and morality, to push farther. This is the way a lot of belief has been practiced. And it's true that some very good and noble things have come from this, but can our acts ever really straighten out the crookedness of this world? We must not forget that this world, it is what demanded grace, and it is grace that lifts us up, that gives us the perspective needed to know how to act, to know how to navigate amongst and alongside each other's callings. It is grace that shores up our constructions of culture and rule, and it is grace that carries us out when we inevitably get walled in. The solution is always grace. It is not in us to fix the confusion of the world, it is in Christ. In Christ we can walk together through acts of grace. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Hebrews 4:16. To reach the position of grace, though, isn't easy. It requires a shift in moral perspective, and it is this shift in perspective more than anything that I believe has sent me outside the church. You see, secular humanism advocates for the improvement and betterment of ourselves, but so does belief without grace. Belief without grace can lead just as much to a buffeted sense of self, just as much to a self-righteous and closed-off world. 'Twas grace that brought us safe thus far, and grace will lead us home. For as long as I can remember, I've been attracted to the radical, to the counterculture, to the people engaged in living non-traditional lifestyles, the people who have shirked off the 9-to-5 and the retirement plan. I read and reread Swiss Family Robinson and Robinson Crusoe, Hatchet, and My Side of the Mountain as a kid. Many of my sympathies towards the natural world make up this attraction, but there is more to it than that. There are deeper motivations at work. I seek these people out because they have cracked the shell of our constructed world in search of something beneath it. They have chipped away at the conveniences and the comforts of our lives to seek out deeper meaning and significance than what they see on the surface. I have shared meals with primitivists dressed in deerskin scavenged from roadkill. I have organized with punks squatting in abandoned buildings. I was arrested in the company of young bearded Quakers in modern plain dress while protesting war. My friends have locked themselves to construction equipment to protect a tree. They have crawled inside oil pipelines while they were being built. They have studied in Chiapas and traveled with refugees. Some of the kindest people I know have been surrounded at night by SWAT teams while providing disaster relief work. I have helped prepare meals for gatherings of hundreds of people on food rescued from grocery store dumpsters. I have had conversations with indigenous elders and worked with unrecognized tribes still actively resisting the US government. Once at a rainbow gathering in the woods, I met a short and hairy man named Spirit with a beard that went low to his chest. Story went, he had 6 brothers and they had spent their entire lives traveling from gathering to gathering. Most of my own life's pursuits have reflected this interest, this intention to live differently. In the last 10 years, I backpacked more than 4,000 miles on long-distance hikes that would span months. In Florida alone, I've paddled more than 2,000 miles, including a record-setting paddle around the state. And I bicycled more than 4,000 miles across North America, traveling with my wife from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic. Altogether, that's more than an entire year and a half living out of a tent and 10,000 miles dedicated to not working. For this, I have had jobs instead of a career. I moved often and rented instead of owned. I had to shrug off the focus and security of traditional goals and set aside some of the examples of good and respectful living. For this, I left home for months on end, voluntarily separated from the warm comforts and regular joys of family and friends. What has driven me to these people so far from the church? We could look to 2 influences of 2 seedbeds in the secular world, detachment and self-gratification. When I say detachment, I refer to where there is a pressure of objectivity to strip away all personal essence of faith and motivation. I've seen this in the secular stance. Charles Taylor talks about it, where one might not want to own up to the Christian label in the company of people aware of the historical violence carried out in the name of the church. There are very real concerns of fanaticism, of abuse and intolerance, and it can be exhausting trying to defend faith while remaining sensitive to other folks' lived experiences. But even in the far radical movements of the left and the right, there are religious sensibilities at work. Being a church member or incorporating practices of faith does not ostracize one from working in movements today. We have seen this in civil rights in the US, where church has remained an important and well-traveled route for engagement. How about self-gratification? What factors there might have kept me outside the church? As so much messaging persuades, did I finally realize that fulfillment was in myself instead of in Christ? I've traveled 10,000 miles by my own power. I've crossed the continent and climbed over mountains on a self-powered bicycle with a seat like this. I mean, talk about pain and suffering. After that, what else do I need to accomplish? What do I need to transcend? Talk about building faith in yourself, building confidence in what you can do. Maybe I did fully internalize the be all that you can be, the be yourself, that you can accomplish anything you set your mind to and greatness is within you. Going into that first long-distance hike on the Appalachian Trail, I did have motivations of self-interest. I did think I would be in the wilderness on my own Lewis and Clark expedition, testing my mettle in mastery of the woods and camping, and of course all the self-affirmation that comes with that. The defeat of the impossible, the pushing of the limits, the determination, the grit, living in the direction of freedom and merit. On day 3, my friend and I walked into an outfitter on the trail, kind of a general store for hikers. On one wall they had a map of the full length of the Appalachian Trail. It was 4 feet high. In our 3 days, at that point, we had completed a couple centimeters of it. The thought of what lay ahead after the difficulty of what we had completed, it was unnerving. Every muscle felt a little bit more sore all of a sudden. Could I really do something like this? Did I really have what it takes? But as the trail started to turn into something more than just a time away, as I began to settle into the simplicity of the routine, the question began to shift. Either at the top of an achingly difficult climb or alongside a stream in a shaded holler, there were people. People walking the same path with their mind on the same destination. People that also had no idea what they had gotten themselves into, but just like me, were beginning to realize they didn't want to be anywhere else. At the heart of it, we had a shared experience, but each of us was also very much hiking our own hike. Much of our day would be spent walking alone, dreaming of our own individual finish, or fueling motivation out of our individual histories and experiences. but together we all experienced the same weather. We climbed the same mountains. We practically stubbed our toes on the same rocks. As you can guess, we made bonds quickly. People from all walks of life with differing political opinions and economic positions, people from different cultures with meaningful traditions and personal values. We related to each other not out of need or boredom, but because we recognized there was a common purpose we all shared, because we all went to sleep with the same destination in mind. We were actively building intimate community while walking side by side as peers and learning deeply about ourselves as individuals. We didn't need to do this, of course. Each of us could have walked step for step, alone and solo, and the summit of Katahdin at the northern terminus of Maine could have been bagged. But the trail was not just a footpath through the woods. It was a conduit for shared purpose. It didn't matter how long it took to get over a mountain, there would be community to break bread with that night. It is through this shift in perspective that I realized that there was nothing wrong with looking towards the world of creation when I was a child sitting in the pew, but that for as long as I looked past the cross, my view of righteousness would always be fuzzy. Clarity would only ever come when I looked through the cross, not past it. We know that more and more people aren't coming back to the church after they leave, and we also know that while the direction of Western living seems to be continuing towards a more loving and just morality, there is not a confident sense of having achieved peace or goodness. There is instead a sense of waging peace, as though the tide of evil keeps pressing up despite our best actions. This remains with or without the church. Within 4 years of attending the National Youth Gathering and looking towards graduation and possibly ministry, I was sitting in a jail cell in New York City, orienting my life in the direction of civil disobedience, protest, and activism, and the church was no longer a place I went. Admittedly, there was a lot that drew me in that direction. I saw Christ's teachings and actions there. I believed Jesus was a radical, and that to walk in Christ was to work against the war and towards peace, was to defend the defenseless, was to question the material, was to be in this world, but not of this world. My time out of the church, though, has not been due to a code drawn together from throwing out the baby with the bathwater in order to engage a secular world. And it has not come from a stance of not needing God to achieve greatness. I believe that the understandings of Luther and the teachings of Christ, alongside marching with others towards an ungoverned moral good, have helped me to notice a shift in moral perspective where it occurs. I would suggest that by not beelining towards these traditional goals, I could personally more easily see acts of grace when they took place, that blowing away the clouds of materialism allowed the light of grace to shine brighter. That is not to say that the radical is the only place of grace, but I believe in its sparseness. It is a space where grace can be the most radically practiced, and it's seen for its transformative, essential power. Seeing these actions of grace nourishes my soul and strengthens my faith when I feel weak. It reminds me to not just feel sympathetic, but to be awake and alive to the real predicament around us. Being a part of these moments, taking the time to act in grace and build community, it is why I haven't returned to the church. Grace needs to mingle with the people in order to restore those in pain. Thank you. Thanks for the time. Sorry.
Andy and I have been talking about Charles Taylor, and I started reading it, and Charles Taylor, the book is A Secular Age. It's not an easy read. It had its origination. Charles Taylor was a professor, Oxford, and then McGill in Canada, and he gave lectures at the University of Edinburgh in 1999. And the book is covering in scope literature, philosophy, theology, society, from 1500 to 2000. He gave those Gifford lectures in '99, and then 8 years later, he wrote the book, filled it in, 700 dense pages, talking about secularism going from 500-year scope of how it's come in all aspects of society. You know his high point of theology? 1870 France, the golden age of theology. Have you ever pondered the golden age of theology, 1870 France? And you know, and I'm reading this, and he does quote a lot of French authors. You read about his background. He was born in Montreal. His mom spoke French. His dad spoke English. I think in the home he spoke French. So he was in, and actually I had to look it up, and French history I didn't know. But 1870 France was sort of the peak of the Catholic Church in France. In the French Revolution, the government seized all the churches. They made all the priests state employees, and the number of priests just dropped precipitously from about 65,000 down to about 25,000. But the church reinvented itself and started practicing their faith more so, and the number of priests grew all the way up to 1870. That's when Napoleon III, the last year of his reign, sort of the high period. But he is a Roman Catholic, and you see that a little bit in the book. And the theology, he's not the greatest theologian, but what he has a great heart of trying to understand and get a grasp on secularism. And he goes from the age of 1500 to 2000. In 1500, the natural world, which had its place in the cosmos and testified to divine action and purpose, God was a part of society. And he calls it an enchanted world. An enchanted world, what he means, and in fact, he says he's not very fond of that term, but it's sort of the antithesis of Weber's disenchanted world. It's a place where God is a part of everything. Luther throws an inkwell, what, at Satan? God is a part, and there's this cosmic battle going on, and that's really a big part of it. And it's interesting, in 1500 he said, you know what, to not believe in God, you had to really do a lot of work. It was hard to not believe in God. And the change started happening with the Reformation. He doesn't mention Lutherans or Luther that often, though he laments, I think he felt a kinship with Lutherans. He said if they would have had, when the communion dispute was going on, Erasmus there negotiating the peace, Lutherans would have still been Catholic. But I don't think so. It's just his perspective. And Calvin, and he does speak a lot about the Reform. I found it interesting when he talked about the priesthood of all believers, or the Protestant work ethic as we sometimes know it. He said it was good because sometimes people's lives weren't meaningful, but it took away a little bit from the sense of the holy. God. If everything is holy, and in fact you make nothing holy because you change that perspective. And he says the midpoint of all that happened in the 500 years was providential deism. And what deism, you may know our Jefferson, probably the most famous American deist, Thomas Jefferson, one of our founding fathers. You know Jefferson's Bible, what was it? Just Jesus' words, no miracles. The deist idea of God was, well, he built the universe, he wound it up, and he's got other projects he's busy with. And that shift happened with deism, and it also, the shift happened where people began to focus inward upon themselves. It was very impersonal. It's not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's a God who made everything, but isn't involved in the world. And it started turning to a sense of natural religion in those years. And this change gradually happened, more so with intellectuals, then with elites, and then gradually permeated society. The next thing he talks about is happening with this. He calls it the Nova effect. And what happens is there's all these different movements starting. Modernity happens. And he said, you know, it's certain things, you know, farms are being left, and where do people start moving to? Cities. People lose that sense of nature. He talks about time. Time is now just a dark abyss. I love the phrase he uses, there's no kairotic moments in society. Remember in Greek, there's ordinary time, and there's kairos, important moments, moments that mean everything. And society begins to lose this sense of kairotic moments. And then we have this expanding universe of unbelief. And that's really the challenges that have happened sometimes with the church and science. And just thinking about the way the church deals with science and how we come along with that. He then goes talking about secularization and periods, the time period from 1800 to 1960, he called the Age of Mobilization. And what happened in those time periods, there began movements everywhere. You had movements with the communists, Marx. His literature sparked movements to go towards that path. There's the psychological movements with Freud. People didn't look to scripture as much. They just started moving inside their head. And all sorts of movements happened in this period, which he called from 1800 to 1960. And then finally, in 1960, we have the Age of Authenticity. And you know, in that age, he says, continues up to the present time. For those of you who will remember the 60s a little bit, you know, society changed a little bit. And the generation now, one of the true things they really want you to be is authentic. And you grapple with that. The topic of our preaching isn't ourselves, but it's Christ. And how do you keep a Christocentric theology going there? And the other thing that's happening with this psychological movement, we've sort of moved our mind and we've sort of gone within ourselves. And he called that the buffered self, which has been going on for the past 100 years of psychology, where really we're the product of our own thoughts and moving away from how others see us or relating with each other. We move in more and more inside ourselves, and we see that more and more with technology going around. Do you know, and for the first 3/4 of the book, he was quite talking about how secularity is rising and how it's more and more a part of the Western world. But the last few chapters, he does talk about, you know what, he's not pessimistic about the future, he's optimistic. Because there are some things. Kevin asked a question. Well, it doesn't seem like secularity is losing. You know, there's a great, I saw in the news last week. Do you know what happened to the U.S. life expectancy in the last 3 years? We had 3 years in a row where it went down again, shorter. The two reasons, what are they? Suicide and opioid addictions. The life expectancy is going down in the U.S. Is medicine getting worse? Not really. But people are hungry. And he says that really when we go and thinking about all that goes on, there's this search for transcendence, there's a search for God. People are asking questions, like the psychiatrist from WashU was talking about. People are looking. The one thing is, he does emphasize, you can't speak church language to relate to them. I think you got to listen to them and figure out where they're at. And in the seminars tomorrow, I'm going to try to bring certain situations, illustrations of doing this. And the one thing, the one theology he did get right was the religion of incarnation. And you know, it's Jesus being the one who speaks and the focus of our faith and the one who speaks today. And I'm looking forward to speaking tomorrow. And my 10 minutes is up.
What I really want to talk to you about is generations and secularity and how those things kind of work together. And every one of you has about 6 generations that are present in your church, or you could have 6 generations in your church, and they're all dealing with this kind of wave of secularity that's coming in, and each one of those generations is going to kind of deal with that secularity in different ways because of when they were born, because of the things that they experienced, and because of the way that they're sort of taking in this secular world around us and processing it together in culture, in the groups of people that they have been born with. And so one of the things that I want you to do in order to start to understand this, and I want to know, is Kathy from Concordia, New York here? She's not. Okay, we'll just have to sing loud enough that she can hear it. Okay, so everybody sing with me. You know the song. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Kathy. Happy birthday to you. Oh, you guys are beautiful. Excellent. I wish Kathy was here to hear that. So we sang that song to one of my students at University Lutheran this past Wednesday. It was her birthday, and we sang it to her, and I'm using that to illustrate a point that she is 22 as of this birthday. That means that she is the last member of this generation that you've been hearing gobs and gobs about, the generation that's called the Millennial generation. And she's old for a college senior. Most of my college seniors are not millennials anymore. They are this group called Generation Z, and they're sort of different. They've grown up in a world that is different from that of the millennials. And a part of what they've experienced is this is the group that has always understood that school was a dangerous place, because somebody could come in and bring a gun. For millennials, that was kind of new. And you have my children, who I'm very excited to say are not a part of Generation Z, because I've been talking about this generational stuff for a while, and quite honestly, Generation Z is probably the generation that I don't like the most. Archetypally, I told my admin that I was going to not like my children if they were born into that generation, and she corrected me. She said, no, you'll love them, you'll hate their friends. So to get a sense of generations, I love to do this. I love to see who's in the room. And so I would like to know, there are 6 generations basically that are alive, 6 generations that we have present at University Lutheran, because we're a student and a non-student community. And I just want to see who's in this room. So members of the silent generation, if you are 73 to 93, is there anybody here who's a member of the silent generation? Excellent. Kind of take a look around.
Very quiet.
Good. All right, very quiet. We can talk about where those names come from later. Members of the baby boom, you currently are 54 to 72.
Wow.
Wow. All right. Members of Generation X, you are currently 39 to 53. Excellent. Members of the millennial generation, 22 to 38. All right, quite a few millennials, yeah, great. And then members of Gen Z, anybody who is under 22 in here? Anybody? And no alphas. Alpha is the new generation, they're 6 and under. And so each one of those generations experiences this secularization in a different way. They experience it because different stuff was happening in their lives. And so as you start to think through, okay, what does it mean for me to live in a secular world? They're going to understand what it means to live in that world in a different way. Those of you who are members of the silent generation, a lot of you kind of felt secularity, but it was weird because you were feeling secularity while the whole world around you was saying that it was very religious. Those of you that were in the baby boom, you kind of worked this sucker. You made this happen with things like Woodstock, with opening up a lot of freedom in terms of sexuality, and all of that stuff came into play in a way that my own generation, Gen X, started to go when we were born. Maybe it wasn't such a good idea to go there. And we started dealing with massive divorce rates, with things like HIV epidemics, with things like that we go, okay, you had this opportunity, now what did you do with it? And so because of that, Gen X folks take a look at secularity, and with this sort of disassociating life from any sort of kind of spiritual understanding, and started to be very hungry about it. Hungry in terms of saying, okay, there's something that's happening in my life that is wrong and I can't quite figure it out. And because of that, we have Nirvana. You're welcome. Millennials. You millennials, you practically encoded secularity into our culture here in the United States. And I mean that almost literally because of the way that this came along with technology, with a rise in technology. But even outside of that, we have had landmark decisions because of people that have been put in office because of millennials. Landmark decisions like things that allow my cousins who are homosexual to be married. And so there's an encoding there that happens with this millennial generation that says this secularity is actually, well, maybe a good thing. Maybe it's a good thing that we're moving away from this connection with this sort of spiritual sense, but at the same time really feeling sort of a gap there. Then there's Gen Z. So Gen Z is very interested in this thing that Taylor talks about called the public sphere. And in fact, they're very interested in having conversations that are face-to-face, but they can't quite figure out, my students especially, how to have those conversations face-to-face unless it's on FaceTime. Because there's this sense of, I need to be connected to, my phone is over there, and that's causing me anxiety. I need to be connected to the public sphere. It doesn't matter who I'm in the room with, but I need to be connected with somebody who is there with me. And that has an effect on how I see the church. And the local church, because of that, becomes a little bit less interesting because the local church is not attached to the public sphere the way that Facebook is, the way that Twitter is, the way that Snapchat is. And then we have Alpha. Alpha is my children. And the one thing that I haven't heard much of today that I hope that I bring across in the next 36 seconds is this. There's hope. There's hope for Alpha. There's hope for all of these generations. And his name is Jesus Christ, but the problem is that we're living in an age where we have birthdays. And because we have birthdays, life changes. And even something as solid in our world as secularity changes. So come to my breakout commercial and figure out how we can process through all of those changes in secularity.
Kevin Ray from Stewart, Florida. So I guess one thing I hear a lot of is fear. You know, a lot of the fear mongering towards millennials because we're changing things. And I guess also it's a little hypocritical on boomers' part, just saying. That's a fact. But the other thing I feel like I hear a lot of is lost Christendom. So what we had was Christendom. We had a state, church kind of union, and it made things very comfortable for us. And now that that's going away, which it is, I mean, it's gone, basically, we're fearful. And I don't understand why we're so scared of that, because that is actually the calling of the church, is to go out into a world and just follow Jesus wherever he leads. You know, and it's not to say this theorizing isn't helpful. It is, and I find it to have a lot of good insights. But I feel like what I hear behind that is we don't know what to do because we lost the thing that we were dependent on. And that bothers me a little bit, because the call is really just to follow Jesus wherever he leads, and he's leading us into a different kind of thing. I guess it's my question, like, is there a way of framing this that's less oriented towards we lost something and maybe more oriented towards Jesus is giving us something new to do?
You want that to any specific individual?
No, I'm curious. Yeah, any of you want to answer that? Yeah.
So, one of the things that Taylor is pretty clear on is that we should not view secularity as a subtraction, that it's simply Christendom that is sort of leaving the house. But rather that something is changing. And I think that, you know, sort of my field, I think we do see that in the generational stuff, where, you know, you did have sort of a lot of play acting that happened in earlier generations. And for the sake of, that's the way that things have always been done. But then after several generations, you get this sense of like, okay, maybe that's gone. So I work with college students quite a bit. And our students are not self-identifying as Lutheran quite as much anymore, just statistically, since in the 11 years that I've been at Florida State. And I think a part of the, you know, a part of the temptation there is to say, oh my goodness, we don't have as many Lutheran students that are coming in. But, you know, the positive way of seeing that is, you know, the Lutheran students that we do have, that do self-identify that way, actually really mean it, because they're not being socially pressured into, you know, choosing the church of your choice for the sake of the common good. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of ways that we can speak, like Dr. Nunes said, with confidence into this, and we have to figure out how we can do that as a church.
I was just going to say one cool thing we saw in the data was we had different profiles that came out, some that were still very much engaged in the church, but maybe not in an LCMS church. And it was cool for them to say, like, hey, I'm glad I grew up Lutheran. Like, Bible study got me in the Word, the community, all that kind of stuff, but I just found a different connection in place for a variety of reasons, and I'm still very active. And so again, I think it was to speak to that thing to where they could see those markings of the church and the things that we appreciate, and see the importance of that was that they're in their lives, to see that this is where I see Jesus leading me in my life with him. And so again, really strong connections that they had to their upbringing with Word and Sacrament.
Next question, please.
Yeah, this is, my name is Chris Escher. I'm from Port St. Lucie, Florida, and it's for Matt. And Matt, like, hey, buddy. You don't have to stand. You don't have to. But it's. I really appreciated what you said here, and I have kind of a two-part question, and I think you can answer it kind of all in one. One of them is, I ask this to people, and they always get defensive. So I'm not trying to make you defensive here, but why did you come and talk to us? And also the second one is, because what you talked about was very impactful, and it's a lot of stuff that I felt personally. And I'm a pastor, and I just try to ask this whenever I can. How do we open spaces for people that feel the way like you do, so that they can come in and join in and have a say in what goes on? Does that make sense?
Great question.
All right.
Absolutely. Just to kind of clarify the two parts of that. Number one, why did I come here and want to kind of take this time to talk to you? You know, to be honest, it's been probably 6 months since Andy approached me about it, and I have been mostly terrified probably the whole time. But out of that, the church that I grew up in, the understanding of what everyone is here for, That's what brings me here. It's the fact that I know, that like we're called to work together. And so there is a part of the secular world that, that does drive that division, and we've discussed it quite a bit today. And it's not working, So to me, it is an opportunity to find areas where we can find common ground, where we can build up. And I think that kind of leads into the second part of that question, and how do you create these spaces for younger people? And kind of as I was saying, the things that drive me are not going to be the same things that drive other people. So I don't know that you can put it into any sort of task list of things that will satisfy people. But what I can tell you is that there is something very there is something very interesting in the idea of like affinity groups, where you come together for a short period of time to conduct a task. Like those groups, the only thing about them is to do action. It's to complete an action. And then that group might break apart, it might organize into a different group. And I think you can have that in churches, I think you can have that in your congregants. It's just a matter of being open to pursue those actions and recognizing that it might not be one person that fulfills that position for 10 years, but maybe once they've completed their task, they move into a different role, and someone else comes forward. And I think that's how we can kind of weave together the individual threads that we all have. So thank you.
Thank you. Is it fair to say it may not happen in the building as well?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the Woodlands held a deep meaning for me in its space and in the building that it was in. But as I became more involved with the larger world, I felt like I had to step outside of that space to be able to act where I felt called to act. So yeah, I would say the church, and if you look at something like community gardens, what you're talking about is a space of land that's turned into something to produce food. But those spaces can become community centers. They can become gathering places, especially for people that might not be able to afford groceries every week, So I do think that physical locations can have a lot of community, can be a space for community gathering.
Yeah, John Glover, Gainesville, Florida. This is to Dave, the Taylor book. Is it fair or not fair? Why not? Taylor critiques the Protestant Reformation. We're responsible for secularism. Was he right? Why not?
He doesn't go that far. He says it's part of the process of individualism taking over, where each person can read the scripture on their own. He said that was just one step of the process. He wouldn't say Protestantism is the cause of secularism, but he said things involved in Protestantism. And he...
Excarnation is a word.
Right, so, and certain things, it's interesting when he goes on, he really critiques Calvinism, and sometimes the moral communities that came out of Calvinism, the moral relation, and it really made way for secular humanism, because the whole thing, and this notion that sometimes in the study said, well, what does the church teach? It's just about what's right and wrong, and then so you can get that with secular humanism, and sometimes Reformed theology that is very law-based, that's all you get out of it. It's not grace.
He also says we're all secularists anyway, and I could gravitate to that because we have a very narrow band of the miraculous, which is the incarnation and then the real presence and baptism, but everything else is sessions. So.
And it's interesting, one of the things I was noticing reading it, so I've been in the ministry 30 years, I've made couple thousand hospital calls. And so I can, it's interesting now, I keep my diagnoses, you know, I sort of mentally say, you know, I give the symptoms and, you know, I can usually get right about 50–60% of the time the diagnosis. And the medical doctors are about 75, right? But you know, it's just sort of when I'm there praying with them, but also I'm running just the scientific data. Okay, you've got this, and this. Okay, and then I bet it's this thing. And my mind is starting to function secularly, scientifically, and not as much on the faith.
Totally.
And there's the aspects of this internal thought patterns that secularism brings, where I'm not always putting God first and foremost.
When I have a headache, I take an Advil, then I pray.
Yeah, exactly.
Mark, did you want to get in on this? Because you looked like you had some thoughts. All right, 1 minute, minute and a half, Kevin.
Yeah, one other question. This is for Matt. I was thinking about what he was saying, and I kind of wondered, Matt, is it partially that you felt like faith and what was outside of the church were kind of divorced? And if so, would a theology that kind of draws the outside world into the church instead of kind of creating that divide that you kind of symbolize with the glass window? You know, like the early fathers had a logos-centered theology where Christ wasn't just the one who saves us, but he was the one who was kind of the anchor point of all of reality. Would something like that be appealing to somebody like you? Or
45 seconds, man.
So, I'm sorry, can the beginning of the question again?
Really quick. No, it's okay. I do it all the time. No, I guess I was just wondering if a theology that, it seems like, I see this in a lot of Protestant churches where there's grace and there's forgiveness, and then there's kind of the outside world, and there can be kind of a disconnect to a lot of people. Would a theology where there isn't so much a disconnect, but the two things are more integrated help? Like, for instance, and this is all Orthodox, okay, it's all good. The early church fathers had a focus on Christ being the anchor point of everything, the whole cosmos, not just the one who forgives my sins, but the creator of the cosmos as well. Would that kind of be a sort of thing that would bridge the gap?
45 more seconds.
Yes, okay, absolutely. And the way that I would probably respond to that is to look at, you know, from my experience, like for instance, with some indigenous rights movements that have been occurring throughout North America, particularly in relation to like oil extraction and stuff, they have a cosmological framework for their activism. They have prayer circles. They attribute their actions towards a creator. I would say that yes, I think that where secularism is falling behind is that is not incorporating the cosmos, is not incorporating Christ-centered. And because I'm out of time, I think a very excellent area to look into this at is the rights of nature, is groups like the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund that look at natural ecosystems not as like the sum of their parts and their ascribed values, but they look at them as being an entity that has its own rights. So it is a different perspective. It is recognizing that it's not just like what you can pull out of it, but that there's something more to it. So absolutely.